In the tumultuous landscape of Stalin's Soviet Union, one man's pseudoscientific theories aligned so perfectly with communist ideology that they were elevated to state doctrine, leading to one of history's greatest scientific tragedies. This is the story of Trofim Lysenko, a poorly educated agronomist whose politically convenient theories resulted in the execution of brilliant scientists, the collapse of Soviet biology, and agricultural policies that contributed to the deaths of millions. Join us as we explore how the marriage of politics and science created a catastrophe whose lessons remain urgently relevant today. Trofim Lysenko was born to a peasant family in Ukraine in 1898, lacking the formal scientific education of his contemporaries. Yet in the ideological landscape of early Soviet Russia, this background would prove advantageous. In 1927, Lysenko first gained attention with his concept of vernalization, a technique that involved soaking and chilling seeds before planting. He claimed this method could dramatically increase crop yields and even allow winter cereals to be grown in spring. For a nation struggling with agricultural productivity, these promises were immensely appealing. More importantly, Lysenko's ideas rejected the established science of genetic inheritance, proposing instead that plants could be radically transformed within a single generation through environmental conditioning alone. This theory aligned perfectly with Marxist ideology, which viewed the concept of immutable genetic inheritance as a bourgeois, reactionary idea that contradicted the Soviet belief in rapid transformation of both society and nature. By 1940, Lysenko had secured the ultimate scientific position in the Soviet Union, being appointed director of the Institute of Genetics within the USSR Academy of Sciences. What made this appointment remarkable was that Lysenko had never conducted a properly controlled scientific experiment in his life. His rise represented the triumph of ideological convenience over scientific rigor. Stalin personally championed Lysenko, seeing in his theories a biological justification for the Soviet belief that human nature itself could be transformed through proper socialist conditioning. If plants could be fundamentally changed in a single generation through environmental factors, then so too could people, a convenient biological foundation for the Soviet project of creating a new Soviet man. Lysenko's presentations to Stalin and other Soviet leaders were theatrical performances rather than scientific reports, often featuring plants that had been secretly swapped to demonstrate successful transformations. These deceptions, combined with his political utility, allowed him to consolidate power over Soviet agricultural science despite producing no verifiable results. What followed Lysenko's rise was one of history's most devastating scientific purges. Between 1934 and 1940, he systematically dismantled Soviet genetic research. An estimated 3,000 biologists were dismissed, imprisoned, or executed for opposing his theories. The most notable victim was Nikolai Vavilov, a world-renowned botanist who had created one of the first and largest seed banks in the world. Vavilov's work preserving biodiversity would later prove crucial for global agriculture, but in Stalin's Soviet Union, his commitment to scientific truth proved fatal. Vavilov was arrested in 1940 while collecting plant specimens in Ukraine. During his interrogation, he was reportedly asked the chilling question, "What is more important to you, science or the motherland?" He died of starvation in prison in 1943, an especially cruel fate for a man who had dedicated his life to ending hunger. The purge claimed many other brilliant minds. Botanist Georgy Karpachenko, who had created the first viable plant hybrid between different genera, radish and cabbage, was executed in 1941. Geneticist Israel Agel was shot in 1937. The distinguished plant breeder Grigory Levitsky died in prison in 1942. These scientists represented the cutting edge of global genetics research before their careers and lives were sacrificed to maintain the facade of Lysenko's pseudoscience. By August 1948, Lysenkoism became official Soviet doctrine when the Lenin Academy of Agricultural Sciences formally declared that Mendelian genetics was prohibited as bourgeois pseudoscience. This extraordinary moment in scientific history meant that the established science of genetics, already proven through decades of research worldwide, was officially forbidden in the Soviet Union. Scientists who refused to renounce genetics were immediately fired from their positions and often imprisoned. Academic journals ceased publishing any research contradicting Lysenko's theories, effectively isolating Soviet biology from global scientific progress. University textbooks were rewritten overnight, with professors forced to teach Lysenko's theories as fact or face severe consequences. An entire generation of Soviet biologists was trained without access to actual genetic science, creating a knowledge gap that would take decades to overcome. The August 1948 declaration effectively criminalized scientific truth itself, forcing researchers to choose between their integrity and their freedom, or even their lives. The human toll of Lysenkoism extended far beyond the scientific community. Lysenko had promised dramatic increases in crop yields that never materialized. Instead, his methods, implemented across the vast Soviet agricultural system, contributed to catastrophic drops in productivity. His rejection of fertilizers and insistence that plants of the same species would not compete with each other led to disastrous planting densities. Fields were sown with seeds planted in tight groups based on the mistaken belief they would cooperate rather than compete for resources, a technique he called cluster planting. Lysenko also made the absurd claim that rye could transform into wheat if grown in the right conditions, leading to massive crop failures when these transformations inevitably failed to occur. His approach to pest control was equally devastating. Rather than using pesticides, which he denounced as capitalist tools, Lysenko advocated ineffective biological control methods. In one infamous case, he rejected evidence that certain insects were damaging cotton crops, insisting they were actually beneficial. This resulted in devastating losses across Soviet cotton-growing regions in the early 1950s, further straining an already struggling agricultural system. Perhaps the most devastating impact of Lysenkoism came when Mao Zedong embraced these theories during China's Great Leap Forward from 1958 to 1962. Chinese agricultural policies, already strained by radical collectivization, adopted Lysenko's principles of extremely dense planting. Chinese farmers were forced to plant crops at densities sometimes 10 to 15 times normal rates, based on the Lysenkoist belief that plants of the same class would not compete with each other. The results were catastrophic. Plants strangled each other, roots could not develop properly, and yields collapsed across the country. This agricultural disaster, combined with other failed policies, contributed significantly to the Great Chinese Famine, one of history's deadliest catastrophes, causing an estimated 15 to 55 million deaths. The tragedy demonstrates how pseudoscientific ideas, when backed by authoritarian power, can spread beyond borders and multiply their devastating effects. Millions of ordinary Chinese citizens paid with their lives for theories that had already failed in the Soviet Union, but which continued to be exported as communist orthodoxy despite their repeated failure. What makes Lysenkoism particularly remarkable in scientific history is how quietly it ended. After Stalin's death in 1953, support for Lysenko gradually eroded, though he maintained significant influence until 1965. That year, a special commission of the Academy of Sciences finally investigated his research station and found his results to be systematically falsified. Unlike other major scientific frauds, there was no dramatic public reckoning. The Soviet government, having promoted these theories for decades and being complicit in the execution of legitimate scientists, could not afford a full accounting of the disaster. Instead, they quietly allowed genuine genetics research to resume while Lysenko himself was simply removed from positions of power. There was no formal acknowledgement of the damage done, no rehabilitation of the purged scientists, and no public admission of error. Lysenko was permitted to keep his apartment in Moscow, his dacha, and even his membership in the Academy of Sciences until his death in 1976. This quiet retreat from scientific falsehood without accountability allowed many of the institutional problems that had enabled Lysenkoism to persist in Soviet science. The episode represents one of history's starkest examples of what happens when political ideology determines scientific truth. Soviet biology lost decades of progress, falling dramatically behind Western research. When the Soviet Union finally allowed genetics research to resume in the 1960s, its scientists had to essentially start over, learning from Western textbooks what their own predecessors had helped discover before being silenced. The damage extended beyond just the Soviet Union, as other communist countries, including Poland, East Germany, and Czechoslovakia, were forced to adopt Lysenkoist principles, setting back their agricultural and biological sciences as well. An entire field of scientific inquiry had been effectively destroyed in multiple countries for decades. The Soviet Union, which had been a world leader in genetics research before Lysenko, found itself scientifically crippled in a field that would become increasingly important in the latter half of the 20th century. As Western countries made breakthrough discoveries in molecular biology and genetics, Soviet science struggled to catch up, handicapped by the systematic destruction of its scientific institutions and the loss of an entire generation of researchers. Perhaps most troubling is how thoroughly Lysenkoism has been forgotten outside specialist circles. Despite causing more deaths than many wars through its agricultural policies and setting scientific progress back decades, it remains absent from many histories of the 20th century. This historical amnesia is dangerous, as it obscures one of history's clearest warnings about the intersection of science and political power. The Lysenko affair demonstrates the fragility of scientific institutions when subjected to political pressure. It took just one politically connected charlatan to destroy an entire field of scientific inquiry in the world's largest country. The episode shows how science can be corrupted when it becomes subordinated to political convenience rather than empirical truth. Lysenko's theories were embraced not because they worked or were supported by evidence, but because they aligned with existing political narratives and promised simple solutions to complex problems. They offered agricultural abundance without requiring expensive technology or acknowledging genetic limitations, a seductive political narrative that overrode scientific reality with catastrophic consequences. What makes the Lysenko affair particularly relevant today is how it illuminates the dangers of allowing political convenience to override scientific evidence. In our own era of polarized politics and complex scientific challenges like climate change, pandemic response, and genetic engineering, the Lysenko affair stands as a stark warning. It reminds us that the integrity of scientific institutions depends not just on the quality of research, but on maintaining independence from political pressure. When science becomes subordinated to ideology, whether to support communist collectivization in the 1930s or any modern political agenda, the consequences can be catastrophic. The appeal of Lysenkoism was never its explanatory power or experimental validation, but rather how neatly it aligned with existing political narratives. This pattern of embracing scientifically dubious claims because they support preferred political positions remains a dangerous temptation in modern discourse. The cost of failing to protect scientific independence can be measured not just in scientific progress lost, but in human lives. Lysenko's story serves as a powerful reminder that science thrives only when evidence, rather than ideology, determines what is true. The tragedy of Trofim Lysenko represents one of history's most profound warnings about the fragility of scientific truth when confronted with political power. What began as a peasant agronomist's ideologically convenient theories resulted in the execution of brilliant scientists, the collapse of Soviet biology, and agricultural policies that contributed to millions of deaths across multiple countries. The most chilling aspect of this history is how easily it happened. How quickly established science was overturned when it became politically inconvenient, and how thoroughly the resulting catastrophe has been forgotten. As we face our own complex challenges requiring sound science and clear thinking, Lysenko's shadow reminds us that the separation between scientific inquiry and political convenience must be vigilantly maintained. When we allow what we wish to be true to override what evidence tells us is true, we risk repeating one of history's most deadly experiments. The stakes of maintaining scientific integrity extend far beyond academic debates. As Lysenko's victims discovered, they can be measured in human lives and generations of progress lost. This forgotten chapter of history deserves to be remembered not just as a Soviet tragedy, but as a universal warning about the dangers awaiting any society that subordinates scientific truth to political convenience. Thanks for watching. Please like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for updates. Your feedback is appreciated. We hope to see you again.